lives of writers.
And there he goes, changing shit up.
We rebranded Ryan.
We did.
It's a natural thing to do in the beginning.
And the name is succinct, clear. It is what it is.
It's very, I stole it from that movie, The Lives of Others, and kind of changed it. But that's basically what, I think the direction this podcast is going, especially with this episode today with Jennifer Calkins, in which we really did something we've wanted to do that we didn't really, which is really dive more into the writer's life. So, in this episode today, as I mentioned, we talked with Jennifer Calkins about her book, Fugitive Assemblage. And then we find out a lot more about her in addition to the book, but we talk about her work in evolutionary biology and in environmental law. We talk about aliens, viruses, and other life forms. We talk about personal hauntedness, and I think it's a really great conversation and kind of the direction we're moving in. And there's some other things on the horizon that I'm not going to get into now, kind of with autofocus and podcasts that made a rebrand a little bit necessary. But anyway,
this was
a long explanation.
My mind, I think I circled back. Like, this was one of those conversations where she would mention something very quickly, and 20 minutes later, I would sit back and go, so you mentioned this. I have to know more.
I remember there's a question toward the end where I'm like, you said this in the beginning, and I've been thinking about it.
Anyway, a little ADD conversation, but I had a lot of fun. It was a good one.
Yeah, it's quite good. And anyway, so we explained that we have a new name. Honestly, we probably could have just sailed right by it, and I don't think people would have noticed. Except if you were searching for it, you might have a little bit of trouble.
Unless there's diehard fans out there.
I mean, like, but we can keep like an autofocus literary podcast as a subtitle in a way, at least for maybe a little while. So
yeah. We'll hang on to some realm of that, I think.
Yeah. Anyway, we're just little runts, and we're growing anyway. So and doing it so well.
I think so. Bio
guy? Yeah.
Okay. Jennifer Calkins is a writer, attorney, and evolutionary biologist. She's the author of a book, A Story of Witchery, and the chapbook Devil Card. And she currently lives in Seattle.
There you go. And before we get into the conversation, let's see, is there anything else we need to talk about? Well, we have a reading, as we often do with our guests. And we have her reading from the beginning of her book, Fugitive Assemblage, up on our YouTube account. So we encourage you to check that out at some point, maybe after this or whenever, some other time. We have I think a couple issues out since the last pod.
Yeah, I think we have. Yeah, we do.
We're moving a little faster there. We're doing like every 2 weeks. I think we'll be able to sustain that for a little while. We have a pretty deep catalog.
Yeah, it's like, remember when Beyonce didn't tell anyone she was releasing her album a few years ago and then just dropped it overnight?
No, I don't remember that.
Okay, so it happened, and I feel like that's what's happening.
I feel lost.
We have these surprise drops.
Well, there's just no reason to like say like this is how it's gonna go. Like this day and age, it's like when we got something we can put. At first I was like, we'll create a publication schedule for the mag and the podcast, and we'll stick to it. And then it's like sometimes we got stuff, and it's like, let's just get it out.
Well, and that's the thing that I'm reading this stuff, and I'm like, okay, wait, we got really good material. Put it in the world.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, no, her book is excellent, and it's really unique. Talk about what we talked about, I think, the very first podcast when it comes to genre and what even is anything. This is a really good example of that.
Yep. And let's see, so other changes, I guess. This might be the last separately recorded intro that we do. We'll see. I mean, we could change our mind, as Ryan has maybe expressed. I happen to do that a lot, but but we'll probably just do these a lot quicker in the future and just do them kind of live on the spot very quickly and move on. I don't know how much you guys out there listening really give a shit about us talking.
I feel like there's a little bit of a whiplash with how many times I've dyed my hair and had a mustache too in the video, like
Yeah,
back and
and
forth.
you look
So
exactly how you were when we started now.
I
Isn't that
know it's
funny?
full circle. I
I
just had to
know.
like let my skin breathe.
And I have this, and if you're watching the video, which may be the last video,
Oh,
because we may be also switching ways to record.
yeah.
I'm not going to get into the technical issues of why, but we may be stopping with Zoom and doing a different platform where video's too expensive and not really worth it. But we'll get better. Anyway, it doesn't matter. You don't care about the audio quality and the way I edit these things. So I'm wearing this hat.
Yes, if you're
that
watching the
that
video,
that
you
Amy
will see
made
this.
me, and it's an autofocus hat. And so I'm going out with a bang on this video where I'm doing like the Garth from Wayne's World, and look, because now I'm bringing this mug up
Oh
to my
yeah.
lips with the autofocus stuff on it.
I would, but mine's full
Yours
of
is full of pens.
you know,
Yeah.
it's a really good desk accessory. It really is. I love it.
There's only really these exist, but we might do like a fundraiser one day and like sell some of these maybe. So if you're watching this, maybe last video, this is my hat, and I'm a walking advertisement. Actually, I'm a sitting advertisement. Anyway, let's get to the conversation here with
Okay.
Jennifer Calkins, and enjoy.
So the book is about a character. So it's a woman, and she's about 10 years older than I was in 1983 in California. And it starts out with her pulling an IV line, pulling the needle out of her arm and walking out of a hospital. And then the rest of the book is her in her car driving north and then east in California. And it's basically, it's a road. The way I think of it is actually a road story. So it's a story of the road, but it's one where she's not riding with any other human. She's basically riding with the ghosts of whatever's in the trunk of her car.
Yeah, I won't spoil. I'm gonna try to be very careful. Anyway.
But there is something in the car, so that's not a spoiler. And
right.
but also the ghosts of sort of her own family history and the way that intertwines with California and California's history. And so it's sort of a haunted road journey.
Yeah. If there's a mood to it, it's like, or a tone to, it's like ghostly. It's like, I've never used that word to describe tone. I don't think before.
That's pretty awesome. I like it.
Yeah, it's not like there's like ghosts everywhere. So it's not like a literal thing, but it's just kind of like, is ethereal the right word? Kind of like you're like something's kind of going on, and you're not entirely sure. Like you're kind of like you're almost like seeing things through like clouds in a way. I don't know if that's makes sense to you. It's kind of like how I felt like when I was reading it.
Like at some points for me when I was reading it, I was like, reading on the page, I was like, is someone watching me right now?
That makes me very happy. I love that.
Yeah.
I mean, the seeing the cloudedness, the ghostliness. I mean, it's interesting because I really like hearing you both describe your experience of reading it, because when I was writing it, and when I go back and read it, it's a weird thing for me because of there is sort of a personal relevance of this stuff to me, and so it's hard for me. And I do honestly feel like someone whose experience of the world is haunted in ways, and so it feels very natural to me to be in that position of haunting. But it's not always clear that how a reader would be experiencing it. So it's interesting that it's the ethereal or not. There's nothing concrete necessarily.
Right. Yeah. Later into the book, you get your footing. It's like you kind of pick it up like probably mid-book, but in that beginning, like you said, you're like not entirely on solid ground. I guess that's kind of what I mean by like ghostly. You feel like you're kind of like floating, kind of like in and out. And you're not really sure, kind of like why this person's going is
Right.
entirely driving north. And there's a lot
Right.
of, like you said, a lot of stuff kind of going on like adjacently, like with family history. And I guess like talk about the form of the book a little bit. So, it's got a paragraph sometimes on a page, or, a little bit more than a paragraph on a page. And I guess like my question is like, to what extent, if any, like, do you think about the fragments of the book? Like, do you think of them as kind of like prose poems, or just do you think of them as like fragmented prose? Or because it's very compact. I don't know, it's just very compact. Like, is it very purposefully, I think, done? So I was wondering if there is like a sense of poetic form to you, or if that's just kind of how it came out in fragments.
So it's a good question. I mean, I studied as a poet, so I really thought of myself as a poet. But even then, my poetry often takes on, it's like I was writing in long poems and narrative poems. So it's like not poetry. And so this, I think I wasn't writing it as prose poems. I didn't think of it as prose poems. It was sort of this, it was basically this really, I was compelled to write it. It like felt like this compulsion. And it was the whole piece that felt like a compulsion, but not, it was never a solid block of prose or a solid novel. And like, I wasn't writing a novel in my mind. I was writing in lyric. And so, but not thinking of the lyric as a each page thing, although that there are breath, there's a breath for each page. So there is a natural pause, but it was more a compulsion to write. So let me take a step back, because I think this is really the way I thought about it, is that I knew that there was going to be this journey, and I had a good idea of where she was going to go. And so the map is really the skeleton of the book. And so that's how I thought of it, is I have a skeleton, and rather than a narrative arc, I thought of the skeleton as being the road, and then the language as hanging off of it. And so necessarily it's not all connected. It's like these fragments of language hanging off of it. So it's like a skeleton. You can think of it as a skeleton with flesh waving, in a ghost or something haunted. But I think that is why I'm having trouble articulating it as a prose poem or as a poem. But I really conceived of it in this way, with the road as a structure and the language hanging off of it. And then it's a really kind of light narrative arc. It felt like that was very light, and that was really what I was aiming to do, was create an emotional response through the language.
And the title comes from, I think, the second epigraph. Sorry, I'm flipping through the book to find it.
Yeah, because we asked Teresa Carmody about her epigraphs, and I'm just so curious of like how they come to authors. If it's this, I think she called it a divine experience. It just kind of happened, or was it something where you stumbled? How did that come to you?
So it's interesting, because I listened to the interview with Teresa, and I thought that was amazing, her description of that, and how they did come to her. I know that the epigraph you're talking about is, "Do not forget you are a fugitive assemblage, a composite whose ingredients are only waiting to come apart." And that was a quote I had already, that I've been thinking about as I've been writing this. And early on, I basically titled it, initially it was we are a fugitive assemblage. But the idea of the fugitive assemblage, or these, a person being these pieces of things that aren't fully held together. That early on, that was driving the narrative. And so I kind of had this quote there early on. The other one is a science quote. that came to me as I mean, I'd already known about the idea of fugitive species. So I've been thinking about that too. So fugitive species doesn't occupy a space all the time. It takes advantage of spaces that open up for it. And so the quote is, for a fugitive species to persist, disturbances must generate colonizable space. And it's sort of a theory in ecology of how diversity can happen. And so I found this quote as I was also looking for texts, scientific texts to integrate into the book, because as you notice, probably there is scientific descriptions of especially the geology of California that are embedded throughout the text. So I can't remember exactly when I found both of these. It was while I was making it. It wasn't a divine. I wish I had experienced Teresa had, but these were two quotes that were part of the way I was thinking about creating the book. And so they basically talk about the creation of the book, but also about what is happening to this main character. You know, that this woman is really this collection of things. And I, you know, like at least how I feel I am is sort of this collection rather than a unitary being.
Yeah. And you are a evolutionary biologist, I found, from so I guess now it makes sense when you read the bio on the back right now why there's the science quote in the beginning. Would you tell us about your background in that or your experiences with that? And I mean, aside from the obvious that you already mentioned, kind of how it informs, you know, your writing, maybe not just this book, but any of your other books as well.
Yeah. So I'm an evolutionary biologist, and my focus of study was animal behavior in particular, and I particularly birds and looking at mating and social systems. And so I did, you know, related to that and my writing there for about, I can't remember how many, so like 2008 through 2015, I did a lot of writing around being a scientist and around working with the species and around what it means to have relationships with other species. And I was focused on these quail that I used to study. So California quail in particular, but then I also started doing research on elegant quail in Mexico. And I had basically a whole project called the Quail Diaries. And so I published some essays on my own blog and then on the New York Times Scientist at Work blog. And my own blog, I was able to do more lyric essays. And that's what I was doing, is a lot of lyric essay around that. And then I also produced a book. I did a Kickstarter to get funding to go down to Mexico, and then I produced a book. So that was a little collection of lyric essays.
Oh, cool.
It's a really direct relationship between the science and the writing, where I was really trying to interrogate really trying to interrogate my relationship to these other species, my experience of being in the field, and those sorts of things relative to the quail. And otherwise, I feel like evolutionary biology is like it sort of framed my worldview. And so I think it influences my writing generally in more subtle ways. And so some of my earlier poetry, it's hard for me to directly identify. More recently, I've been working on a collaborative project about climate change with Anne DeMarkin. And my biology is coming back in there, and my science background is coming back in there too. So I've got a series of poems. It's sort of a long project that we've been doing, but this is coming into the poems is the science, and the baseline across all my work is this idea of sort of this interconnectedness, and that's really what evolutionary biology. You know, my framing is anti-hierarchical. I don't believe in I don't believe in the validity of the hierarchies we use to structure our relationships with other animals, with other species, with the rest of the world. And I also see I have a really, like, my sort of spirituality is in that experience of kinship and connectedness. And this, if you go outside and it's just loud with trees, like they're so there and they're so loud. And so that's been entering a lot into this more recent work. I think, with Fugitive Assemblage, it really was pulling on the science and bringing it in, and the idea of California as this geologic and biologic space.
And kind of metaphorical.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you're also an attorney, and so we did briefly talk about this before we were really rolling. Would you talk a little bit about your experiences as an attorney and what you're doing? You don't have to go, too much into it. But also just the little bit I know, I mean, what you said about, hierarchical structures in society, I feel like it relates. And so I think that was maybe a good time to go into that.
Yeah, that's a very insightful, because, and I should have thought of that a little more before I went to law school. I went back to school in 2015. I'd been on an adjunct track. I was married, and my ex-husband he's pretty successful scientist, and so I'd followed him, and it was hard for, I was going to have to basically drop everything and move somewhere else to jump back into the academic track if I wanted to get anywhere. And I decided also I wanted to have more direct impact than I thought I could as a biologist, research biologist, because I felt like it was more of a triage. The environmental crisis is a triage situation. There's no fucking time to sit and watch quail, even though I would do that, did it for thousands of hours. I would do it for thousands and thousands more. But I went back to school in 2015 to UW Law, and I came in like with this sort of literary biological way of being, and the law is not that. And so it's interesting to go back to school as an older person and kind of collide with this inherently hierarchical structure built by white men to preserve their property, which is essentially what American law is. I mean, that's the most fundamental goal of it. And to try to engage with the things that mattered to me and the reason I was there, which is, there are a lot of things that I don't want to belie the fact. I don't want to suggest that I want to, that people doing criminal defense work, people doing immigration work, people work with the humans is of central importance. But I was really drawn to the environmental law because of my work as a biologist. And it's the law. I had a class early on where we were talking about artificial light on beaches in Florida and turtles,
Oh, cool.
And how do you get at the property owners? And it took me a half an hour to understand, the turtle, you can't go into the court and say, this is going to hurt the turtle. You don't have a personal injury case for the turtle. There is no other being that has a right to go up in court and ask for relief except for humans. And suddenly I realized how weirdly narrow the construct of law is. And then I went and worked at the court after I graduated, and it was I want to say it was a very good experience, but it's also very much a hierarchy. And midway through, I was like, oh, wait a minute. That's why I'm so confused all the time about how everything works, because I don't understand these kind of implicit hierarchies that we create everywhere. So it's, the law is not a natural thing for me. I find it really, really interesting, though. And I do find sort of the creative uses of the law really appealing. And so that, what I think with environmental law is a lot of what you're doing is really creative work, because the law is not structured. And so right now I am actually just starting a fellowship with the Western Environmental Law Center on Monday. So I'm in transition right now, but basically doing environmental law work.
How do you find the time to work to write? How do you find the time to write with all the?
So I mean, I write on the weekends and in the evenings. And my kids. I mean, especially now during the pandemic, I'm not going out with friends or and
Sure.
one of my kids just went to college, and so he's not here, and I split time with my ex-husband. So I do have chunks of time where I'm really alone and I don't have, I mean, I have to take care of my pets, but I can use that time to write. So,
it reminded me, I have to go back to the trees real quick. I'm so sorry.
okay.
I have to go back to so my friend did a kind of residency with Joy Harjo, and like, every day I would get a text like, Joy's talking to the trees again, or like Joy's thinking of the space. So I guess it's kind of a loaded question, but I'm just so curious, like, what's the intersection between like your science life and then like your spirituality life, and how that kind of goes hand in hand? Because it's not something that I see a lot of, and I'm just so curious about that.
Yeah, and that's a great question. The concept, so that what evolutionary biology, and I feel like I need to take a step back and make clear that I understand that evolutionary biology is is a colonizer's construction of the world, and it has been used wrong, to the detriment of people, including by the Nazis. And so I want to make it clear that my spiritual connection to evolutionary biology is one that's sort of this pure, the idea, the fundamental idea of interconnection and dynamism. And so it's really, I mean, Darwin's problematic himself in his writings, but I do think that he never argued for the kind of survival of the fittest and that kind of stuff that got layered on his theory later on. And for me, part of, so some of it is just this interconnectedness and the fact that we can now map that through our genetic relationships, and you can see the relationships and you can see how much we share. Part of it is also the way evolutionary biology talks about the interactions of an individual with his or her or their environment. So I guess it's just these patterns that you can see between an environment and an individual species, and the pure diversity of ways that species have moved through time and space to occupy these different environments. And so, like with the trees, I mean, I don't know that there has to be a connection. As I'm talking, I mean, I go hiking. I've been going hiking every week during the pandemic out in the Cascades, and just, and like if you go up and you touch a tree, like a Douglas fir, and it's, just thinking about the fact that this is a living being, this is my kin. And at the same time, like the structure is so different, its experience of time is so different from mine. There's not a softness on the outside, but that there's life inside of it. And this all seems kind of wild.
This is right up my alley. Trust me, I love this.
Well, I'm glad. I mean, I'm articulating something I feel, and I do. It's interesting because my grandfather is central to the book, and he was someone who, when he was young, his mother was as a fundamentalist, and he was at church when he was 7, and he basically, the family legend is that he left and he was like, I'm done, I'm never going back to church. And he went out, and his church was the woods, and And it really was. And there is some of this kind of white male being in the woods, your church is the woods, you're kind of appropriating sort of these Native American relationships. That is problematic, but I will say he influenced me in that way. So I grew up with that, and I also grew up in a household where we lived with a number of other animals, and the animals were, we were all sisters and brothers, basically. Like, it was a very, very much you take care of the creatures that you live with the way you take care of each other. And so I think those are kind of foundational, but then evolution gave me a way to look at the patterns. And because I tend to be analytical, it also gave me a way to kind of calm down the analytical piece of my mind while I'm engaging in kind of these relations.
Yeah, I just love learning about like the science, or what I find the new science. I don't know how valid it is, totally, to be honest, but it's, when you talk about earthing or just going outside barefoot and what that could do to the human body, or when you are under a tree and when there's the actual exchange of, when you're breathing and what that does to you under the tree. I find that so compelling, the kind of tie there between something that is scientific of, yes, it is a living being, and then what can that do for somebody?
Right.
So I love that. Yeah. I
definitely think there is an exchange. I mean, there is the environment around a tree is different because, and it is, that's another, I also am really interested in deep history. And so from an evolutionary point of view, oxygen wasn't on this planet until photosynthesizing organisms created it. And so we are like, that sense of the exchange is a real physiological, biological, physical phenomenon. It's a real thing. And so it's definitely something that happens.
I want to ask you, you mentioned, your interest in patterns and kind of, and your analytic mind. And I was wondering, if that's something, in the act of creation, like literary, creation, is that something that, when you're in that act of creation, you put aside, or do you think that the pattern making, like plays a kind of role? I mean, maybe that's more revising and editing. Maybe you bring that kind of part of your brain out. So I guess that's my question in general, but also, specifically with this book, to what extent, if any, did pattern making play a role in the form?
And it's a good question. So the book, I mean, I think part of the pattern making throughout the book is the lines that I include, like the collision between my own writing and then these excerpts from other people. And I think that's pattern making because there's something that happens when you do that emerges, or it's maybe not pattern as much as sort of an alchemical chemical, like mixing reagents together to get something emergent. And in some ways, I think of patterns as that kind of thing where you're looking for the emergent qualities to them anyway. Which is what you see with a living, if you look at sort of the simple chemical elements that go into a living being, is like a very simple pattern that then gives rise to sort of this complex phenomena. So I think the most sort of granular thing is just using that appropriated language against my own language. More broadly with this book, I think I was also thinking a lot. I actually will say, I talked to a geographer recently, and after we were talking about animal geography, but afterwards I thought, wait a minute, my book is geography. And that's the other pattern, but I hadn't recognized that this is a geographical text. And so in a way, I had a kind of scientific engagement with California in 1983, in the physical being in that space and in these different parts of that space. And there was also definitely an intention to where she was in space at any one time along the map. So I did have a map out as I was writing it, and really trying to allocate space relative to the amount of time she's spending in any particular place.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think with this text, that would be where the analytical piece of it was coming in. I think I will say, though, I do feel like there's a way the writing, I have to also have room for discovery in the writing in a way that I can't have either my, the legal analytical mind or the scientific analytical mind interrupting it. And it's like a relief for me, it's something I have to do. I thought I would stop writing when I went to grad school the first time. And I told myself, no more poetry. You're going to be a scientist. And I just couldn't do it. Like, it felt really necessary for me to keep doing it. And so then I was like, okay, I'll just get an MFA then, because then I can legitimize my writing. And so there is a need to have sort of a separate space in some way.
Yeah. When you draft, do you feel yourself like working against that at all, or do you think maybe at this point you were able to just kind of like flip the switch and generate?
So, I mean, I don't know about flipping the switch. Like, but I do feel like it's because I always sort of, I've been. This has actually been a constant struggle for me because I am a writer. Like there's this artistic pull for me, but I have felt compelled to follow these professional tracks. I just never allowed myself to just be a writer. I always felt like I needed these other things in my life to have the ability to write. But it also means that when I'm writing, I feel like, this is like I'm really lucky to have this little bit of time to write. And that makes it easier to shut the other stuff off in a way. When I was writing this book, it was really compelling, but and to write it, I felt this compulsion, and it also was just this pleasure at stealing this time to do it. So I think, I'm trying, it's interesting. I'm trying to think of, as I'm sitting writing, is that piece coming in, and it just feels, there are the other things that come in as a writer where you feel, kind of insecure or anxious, or you can't, sometimes you're like hammering at something or whatever, but the legal and the scientific, those are able to quiet pretty easily.
I know Ryan has a really fun question for you.
The alien question?
Oh, okay, so look. Do you believe in aliens? And how long have they been around for? Like, come on.
So the alien, I have been really Earth focused in my entire career.
Okay.
So I've always kind of left the alien expertise up to sort of the NASA or other scientists. But I will tell you, like, there's been all these murmurings. At first of all, I think they're quite possibly, I'm open to it.
Sure.
And is it Area 51?
Yeah. Oh man.
I grew up, in the 70s and 80s, California. What was his name? I listened to, I can't believe it. He's a late night radio host. Okay, well, I can't remember his name, but in one show, someone called in because they saw Jimmy Hoffa walking down a train track. But most of the shows involved aliens and abductions and all of that. So, and I'm thinking right now, I can remember some show I watched about, in the 70s about aliens, and the abductions. I do think it's quite possible they're aliens, and they're quite possibly way, I guess fundamentally though, I think if there is life that is not earthbound, it's not a life we can actually necessarily even conceive, because Earth evolved
Yeah.
one organism, one kind of organism, and was immediately constrained by what that life was on Earth at that moment. And we are all the result of that initial thing. And so on a different planet, who the fuck knows? I mean, I don't think it would look like us. And I think,
right.
I mean, I actually love Philip Pullman. I don't know if you read his trilogy, but
I haven't.
He's got different dimensions, and he does what I liked about one of his, what he had in one of the dimensions was that these were creatures that were not, like, he describes them as they're just beings we wouldn't have ever imagined. I mean, except he imagined them, but they wouldn't be anything that would have evolved here. And so the idea that life, if there is alien life, it's not, we have no fucking idea.
It's like the definition of life then becomes, kind of altered in a way.
We already have that problem because the definition of life is about, I'm going to be didactic, but when I used to teach intro biology, and so I talked about what is life, and it can reproduce, and it can create its own energy, because with the physical properties of matter, that they'll continue to go to chaos unless you input energy into the system. So living creatures need to keep taking on energy to maintain an order within the system. So you have to be able to metabolize, and you have to be able to reproduce. But then what the fuck is a virus? and so the virus, because they harness our cells for that shit. But they're like this in between thing. And so I think we already have that problem of what is a living being, even like right now. And we're facing it, anytime people, like all the metaphors about the wars against COVID, and like what are these viruses? So
it's a question of the age.
It definitely is, but but I think it relates to the question, of other life forms in the universe, and what form they would take.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I've definitely never thought of that before. I'm waiting for your alien book now.
No. Yeah, I mean, that could be, I would love to try to get my kids to collaborate writing. I mean, they're not here. They would be like, fuck no, mom. But there's part of me is like, okay, maybe if it was aliens, they'd collaborate with me. They won't even, they've been to my readings, but I can't get them to read my book.
I hear that's a thing. Like, where like kids don't want to read their parents' books.
I think it's pretty typical. Yeah.
That's so interesting to me, because I feel like if like one of my, I mean, who knows? Like, I feel like if one of my parents was a writer, like I'd be like aching to be of an age where I could see what they were trying, like what they were saying.
You would think so, but no, there's other stuff they'd rather read.
Yeah, but I also can understand though, as a kid, like if my parent had written a book, I'd probably roll my eyes at it. And
I mean, they're like, okay, whatever, mom.
Yeah. Maybe it's better that way though. You just leave them.
Yeah, I guess the flip side is if they do read, well, and actually my son did read my first book, and he wrote a book report about it, and one of the questions would you recommend this book to a friend, and he said no.
He's a real critic.
His best friend at the time really liked it and wanted to put on a play. So I was relieved because Max liked it, but no, my son is like, no.
I'm just looking at your bio, and is that a story of witchery?
Yeah, and that
was first one.
Ray Feigs published it when Teresa was at the helm. Amazing editor.
When did that come out?
2006. And
so what's that book about? I mean, I guess I could go back and buy it and read it. But
so it's it's this long narrative poem and it's a fairy tale. And it really grapples with medical trauma. So it's basically a narrative where the protagonist is experiencing a fairy tale, going through basically a fairy tale experience. The antagonist in it is Dr. Rex Morgan. So she keeps ending up in these medical situations, like with this, I don't know, a variety of beings that are basically performing medical acts on her. And it derives from, I had an early medical trauma, which is sort of basically the trauma that led me to finally get a PTSD diagnosis when I was older. And so the book kind of came out of that. But it's different from this book, but I had been thinking this year about the fact that they're both ways of grappling with trauma, and they're both non-traditional narrative structures for grappling, and that's what I've gravitated towards for grappling with questions of trauma.
Yeah, when you were explaining it, I was seeing a connection
Yeah.
in the book. So yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned, earlier, you said, I kind of put a pin in my head when you said it,
Okay.
because I thought it was so interesting. You said, like, your experience in the world is, like, you feel your experience in the world is in some way haunted. Do you remember saying that?
I do. I mean, something
I was wondering if you would talk about it. I found that to be such an interesting thing to say, and I was just wondering what you mean by that.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. Part of it is, I think, derives out of this experience of having trauma when it was basically pre-verbal trauma. That is very hard to address when you're older because you experienced it before you had language. And, it's interesting. One of the other authors, Marilyn Freeman, her book addresses, talks a lot. Her book's very different than mine in that it's talking about video essay. But she does talk about her own experience of trauma there, and talks about what she calls real time and trauma time. And if you're someone who has experienced trauma, you always then live in this realm where you're having a real time experience, but then there's the trauma with you. And so for me, that would be, like so there was a point when I was younger that I sliced open my hand and I was bleeding everywhere and I needed stitches, but I became hysterical at the idea of going to the hospital. I didn't want to go. I was super resistant. And I'm not someone who's, like, I cut myself all the time. I'm pretty clumsy, and, my cats scratch me or whatever. So blood doesn't bother me, but I was pretty hysterical, and it wasn't the blood that was fucking everywhere. It was going to the hospital. And there were repeated occurrences like that. And that was because I was both experiencing the cut and this emergency at the same time that I was reliving whatever traumatic event happened to me. And there's no way to separate there is. Marilyn's theory is that there is a way to separate those through art and through the practice of observing. And so, but it is a sense of being haunted. You're always haunted by that.
Yeah.
I think the other thing, though, is I've been reading a lot more about sort of our haunting as a nation, as the haunting that we experience being in America right now. And I read I can't think of the name of the book, but Avery Gordon has this amazing book that talks about the fact, the idea of the ghosts of sort of these, like the ghosts of the indigenous genocide and the ghosts of slavery, and the fact that those ghosts are at the door all the time. We're haunted by them all the time because we actually haven't turn around to face them and to recognize their presence. So I've been thinking about that a lot as well. And then on top of it, I mean, this is maybe silly, but I've had lived with a lot of other species. You know, we've had rats, we've had birds, we've had chickens, which are also birds, and cats. And we have a lot, I have a lot of both non-human and then human beings that I've lost that, are kind of there as well. Even to the point, I had been dating a guy who then died in an avalanche, and I didn't find out he died until the week Trump was elected.
Oh my gosh.
And so it's interesting because I'd been kind of haunted. Like I was, my first thought was, well, fucking thank God he didn't have to see Trump get elected. Jesus Christ, that's a blessing. But it was also, he kind of has been in the background for me because his death happened then, around then, and because I learned of it then. And then we experienced the whole Trump trauma, and it was always like this conversation there. So that's kind of a long explanation of sort of all the different ways I feel like there are ghosts. I have also, when I've been hiking, I think my vision's kind of shitty, and so I often see things out of the corner of my eyes that are also kind of spectral. So it's also sort of visionary, being haunted by shit out of the corner of my eye.
Interesting. So I wanted to ask you about some of the appropriated text in the book, as you mentioned it a little bit earlier. And so it's unattributed, like you attribute them kind of later, like in the acknowledgements you list, places where, or authors whose work appears aside yours. And it's not really like predictable or even like entirely self-evident when you see them necessarily, like what the connection is. And it's like, it's almost like, it almost feels like turning, like surfing channels on the radio, where you have these, like, that's kind of how I imagined it, where it's like you're driving and there's kind of these like bits and fragments kind of coming into you as you're, is that like silly? But that's kind of how I know it wasn't the radio. Like I'm not trying to say that, but it's just kind of how I felt it.
Yeah, that their voices, and they aren't, there's not a direct link to what the narrator's saying. Yeah, I love that description of it.
So where in the process did these come in, and like, were they bits and pieces you kind of had and you knew you wanted to use them from the beginning, or kind of in what way did it come about in the process of your writing?
So I started years ago keeping notebooks as I read. Poetry and I don't usually do this with the legal or the scientific writing, but literary writing, I basically just write lines from texts that as I read. And so I've got tons of notebooks full of it. And I've gotten more systematic in doing it. But as I was working on this, I basically just started pulling the texts. As I wrote, I would pull a text and put it in. And I was doing that already with my lyric essay writing. And although I tended to embed, sorry, I'm coughing now.
You're all right.
I don't have COVID, I don't think. But
you have, I've been talking for almost an hour voice.
Yeah, I haven't. So in this book, and what I'm finding now while I'm working on this climate work is that there's almost like an alchemy, kind of like what I talked about earlier, that when you slap one of these appropriated texts against my line, something else emerges that's not the original text and is not my line. And it really is part of my writing process to do that. And so I was it started with these notebooks, and for the most part I was using the notebooks to do that. Every once in a while I would feel like I needed some geologic, texts about the geology of California or about the natural history, and those are ones that I would seek out.
Mhm.
But otherwise, it was lines I already had. But it was pretty random, just flipping through the notebooks, pulling a line and putting it in, and then something would emerge from it in some way.
So yeah, so it's interesting. So it was kind of like a part of the process, basically.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's
I mean, the
cool.
radio, that's why the radio, and there was a relevancy to all of them have a relevance. And I should step back. There were books. So there were the books, three kinds of books. There's the Anatomy of Melancholy, which I was reading, and that a lot of the quotes are from Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. And then there were the quotes from the women who crossed, and those are really the pioneer women who came across. And then there's some of the early California texts. So Brewer's text about going up and down California in the 1800s, and then the Emigrant's Guide, which was a guidebook. So that's also an important component where they were basically texts I'd been reading because I wanted to write about my grandmother, my great grandmother, who had crossed in a covered wagon. And so I'd been reading about all of that, but the form of what that was going to become wasn't clear to me. And so then I went back to those when I was writing this book and used them.
They were fugitively assembled into the
Honestly, that is, part of my thought with the title is that it is exactly what I did with the text.
Yeah, no, I definitely felt felt the link to the title.
There was a line. I'm such I have to go with the thesis, what's the main idea here, and the line that stood out to me while I was reading that I was okay, hold on, and I just had to pause was the ocean lust is a family thing.
Yeah.
And just because it was just I felt like it captured a lot of the main concepts where it's lust looking for going going towards something, obviously the family tie, and then this idea of nature kind of being wrapped up in everything. So I throughout this book, this isn't a question, I just have to kind of say it just it just felt like every single word and break and moment was so thought out. It was just so thought out with that, and so it kind of made you pause and kind of naturally do that, which I find rare to see, but it's that good balance of poem and prose, that I think is exactly what that book or what this book is.
Yeah, there's a lot of space left in there for you to think before you turn the page. That's why it's a relatively short book. I think it was I want to say 1.5 sitting. I know it's a weird thing to say, but there was a half sitting in there where I got something with the kids and got distracted. But there's so much space around the text, and I do feel like that kind of ties into that kind of ethereal mood or ghostly mood I was talking about. It is literally the placement of the text on the page, I think, does that. And so it's not a book where you're gonna turn the pages as fast as you can. It's you really kind of got to read one and kind of process it and kind of work through, especially in the beginning, whoa, what's happening here, because there is that like you said, you're not on the solid ground yet, until later in, and then your brain, once you get to that point, then your brain kind of backtracks and you start to kind of assemble kind of the pieces in your mind. So I thought, just the way that the text is set up on the page is so important. And I will turn this into a question. I was wondering, when you wrote it out, did you did you break up on your big, I'm assuming Microsoft Word document or something? Did you have maybe one paragraph on a page and all the space around it to show like how you wanted it to be laid out on the book, or did you kind of just let them, like the publisher, kind of lay it out like that?
So I laid it all. I didn't lay it out ultimately. I mean, Dan did a lot of work in it, but I when I submitted it, I had page breaks. So when I wrote it, I just had space, and then I went through and I do think as we worked together, there were a few places where we added space or we moved text around. So as they laid it out, we did more work on it. But some of the way it feels is because of sort of the work they did in creating an object that could be in space, as opposed to what I gave them to work. What
a virtual document,
and less sort of attention to. I mean, some attention to the aesthetics, but less than what they ended up doing.
Well, Ryan, you got anything else?
Yeah, I have plenty.
Keep going.
But it's all like, who made the Easter Island statues? Who built the pyramid? Like, I need to know this off air.
Those are not answers that I have. They are things I wonder as well.
All right, that was our conversation with Jennifer Calkins. Remember, you can check out her book, Fugitive Assemblage, and her reading of the beginning of that book on YouTube. Also, you can check out autofocuslip.com. We're at issue 6 right now, and more to come soon.